The year was 1884, and for Esther Hale, time had clotted like old blood. 2 winters had passed since the fever had stolen her husband, Henry, and then their daughter, little Clara, leaving Esther in a silence so profound it had its own weight. She lived on a small homestead at the frayed edge of Redemption Creek, a town whose name was a cruel joke. There was no redemption here, only judgment, hard as the packed earth of its single street. The land itself was a study in severity, vast wind-cord canvas of brown and grey that offered little comfort and demanded constant toil. Esther's life had shrunk to the size of her loss. Her days were a metronome of chores, a rhythm of survival that kept the deeper currents of grief from dragging her under. She woke before the sun. Its first pale light, finding her already in the dirt of her garden, coaxing stubborn life from the unforgiving soul. She mended, she cleaned, she preserved. Each task was a bulwark against memory, a way to fill the hollow spaces Clara's laughter and Henry's quiet strength had once occupied. The townsfolk saw her as a phantom, a woman wrapped in perpetual mourning, and they left her to it. Their pity was a blade she did not wish to feel, and their piety a suffocating blanket. So she kept to the margins, a solitary figure moving through a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her isolation was a fortress she had built brick by silent brick. Inside its walls, she was safe from the whispers and the pitying glances, safe from the casual cruelty that Redemption Creek reserved for anyone who did not fit its rigid mold. This cruelty was most often directed at the Cheyenne, whose ancestral lands the town had been carved out of. They were specters from a past the settlers wanted to forget. Their presence on the outskirts of town, a constant, unwelcome reminder. They were called savages, seeps, heathen swords, spat like tobacco juice, staining the air with contempt. Esther heard the talk on her rare trips into town for salt and flour, and she simply lowered her head, making herself smaller, wanting only to finish her business and retreat back to the quiet ache of her solitude. Her grief was a world unto itself, leaving no room for the injustices of the one outside. It was a trip for kerosene and thread that shattered the fragile peace of her existence. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on the dusty street. A commotion had gathered outside the mercantile, a tight knot of self-righteous anger. At its center stood Arthur Vance, the town's blacksmith and self-appointed arbiter of justice, his face flushed with power. Before him, held firm by 2 grim-faced men, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 15, a slip of a thing with wide, terrified eyes, and the proud, sharp features of the Cheyenne. Stole a whole sack of flour. A woman shrieked, her voice thin and sharp. Right from my wagon. The girl, whose name Esther would later learn was Mesa, said nothing. Her silence was not an admission of guilt, but a wall of dignity against their hate. She stared straight ahead, her small frame trembling almost imperceptibly. We have laws against thievery in this town. Vance boomed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. He enjoyed these moments, the rapt attention of his neighbors, the fear in the eyes of his victim. And we make examples of thieves, 10 lashes, let it be a lesson to her kind. A collective gasp, part horror, part grim satisfaction, rippled through the crowd. 10 lashes could break a grown man. For a child this light, it was an act of unspeakable brutality. Esther felt a cold sickness wash over her. She saw the raw terror that finally broke through the girl's composure, her eyes darting around, searching for a friendly face and finding none. In that terrified gaze, Esther saw a specter of her own Clara, lost and alone. Something inside her, a chord of maternal instinct, she thought long dead, pulled taut. The numbness that had been her shield for 2 years cracked, and a hot, fierce rage poured into the fissures. Before she understood what she was doing, her feet were moving, carrying her through the parting crowd until she stood before Arthur Vance. The town went silent, mouths agape at the sight of the reclusive widow stepping into the center of their drama. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice rusty from disuse, but surprisingly steady. He turned, his eyes narrowing. Mistress Hale, this is no concern of yours. The girl, Esther said, her gaze fixed on him, ignoring the burning stares of the townspeople. She is just a child. Whatever she did, this is not justice. It is cruelty. Vance let out a short, humorless laugh. It's the law, Mistress Hale. The law she broke. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She looked past him to Mesa, whose dark eyes were now fixed on her, filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope that was almost painful to witness. The decision was not made with thought, but with a visceral certainty that rose from the deepest part of her soul. It was an act of defiance against the death that had taken everything from her, a sudden, fierce need to protect the life that stood shivering in front of her. "Now then, let me," Esther said, the words falling into the stunned silence. "Let me take the punishment for her." A wave of disbelief rolled through the crowd. Arthur then stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Esther insisted, her voice gaining strength. "She is a child. I am a grown woman. If a debt must be paid with a whip, let it be paid from my back. 10 lashes. I will take them in her place." Vance's face was a mask of confusion, which quickly curdled into a sneer. He saw a chance to assert his dominance in a new, more interesting way. To whip a Cheyenne girl was one thing. To publicly humiliate the widow of a respected man like Henry Hale was another level of power. He could break her strange pride and reinforce his own standing in one go. "Very well, Mistress Hale," he said. A cruel light dancing in his eyes. "A debt is a debt. Tie her to the post." Two men, hesitant at first, moved to obey. Esther did not flinch. She walked to the hitching post in the center of the square, her movements deliberate. She untied the bonnet from her head, letting it fall to the dust. As they pulled her arms forward, she turned her head and met Mesa's gaze. The girl was frozen, her face a portrait of horror and disbelief. Esther gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent command to be strong. Then she closed her eyes and braced herself, focusing on the memory of Clara's hand in hers. The first lash was a line of pure fire drawn across her back, stealing the air from her lungs. A collective gasp went through the crowd. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, but refused to cry out. The second followed, then the third, each one a fresh wave of agony. The world narrowed to the rough wood of the post beneath her hands and the searing pain that consumed her. She counted them in her head, each number a small victory against the darkness that threatened to swamp her senses. At 10, it stopped. For a moment, she sagged against the post, every muscle screaming. The world swam back into focus, hazy and distant. They released her. She stumbled, but forced her legs to hold. Without looking at anyone, her back a tapestry of raw, bleeding welts. She retrieved her bonnet from the dust. She could feel every eye in redemption creak on her, a mixture of shock, disgust, and a sliver of grudging awe. She did not care. She pushed through the silent crowd and began the long painful walk back to her homestead, leaving the town, the girl, and the reasons why behind her. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. The following day dawned in a haze of pain. Esther had spent a fitful night, her back on fire. She had managed to clean the wounds as best she could with salt water and apply a pus of yarrow, but the simple act of breathing was an exercise in agony. She moved through her morning chores with slow, deliberate care, her body a stranger to her. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard, she saw them. 5 figures on horseback cresting the low ridge that marked the edge of her property. They were Cheyenne, their silhouettes unmistakable against the pale morning sky. A knot of pure fear tightened in her stomach. They had come for her. Perhaps they thought she was responsible for what happened to the girl. Or perhaps they were here for some other more violent reason. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She had no weapon save for a small hatchet by the hearth. It would be useless. They rode not with aggression, but with a slow, solemn purpose. They dismounted at her fence line, a clear sign of respect, and approached the cabin on foot. Esther stood frozen in her doorway, watching them come. They were all tall, powerfully built men, their faces stern and unreadable. The one in the lead, who looked to be the eldest, had a long scar that cut across his left eyebrow. She expected a confrontation, a demand. Instead, what happened next defied all her expectations. When they were a few paces from her porch, the 5 men stopped. Then, as one, they lowered themselves to their knees in the dusty yard. They bowed their heads, their long black hair catching the morning light. The eldest one looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. They held no malice, only a profound, unsettling gravity. "We are the brothers of Mesa," he said. His English was clipped and heavily accented, but clear. A gesture to himself and then to the others. I am Bulkin. These are my brothers. Metabato, Undajaka, Boca, Chaitan. Esther could only stare, bewildered. Her mind struggled to make sense of the scene. 5 Shan warriors were kneeling in her yard.